Should we begin? I think we should begin. Okay, sir. So we're going to begin this talk. So hello, everyone. I'm Shivangi, and I'm speaking on behalf of Humanizing STEM. This is a project which is meant to bring together the disciplines of science and humanities and essentially poses the question of how do we bring in the human element into the sciences. And so this is our second talk, and we have Mr. Harsh Mander. Sir, I can't see your video.
Can you see me now?
Yes. Sorry, that I think there was something on my end. Yes. So I'm going to try to introduce you, although the work you've done, it's larger than life. But for those of us who are not acquainted with your work, So I'll try to introduce you in a few short sentences. So you are an author, a columnist, a human rights worker, an activist, and a researcher. You have been the director of the Center for Equity Studies, which is a research organization based in New Delhi. You have written about what it is like working with the most disadvantaged groups in the society for over 2 decades. And you have convened and co-convened groups on the communal and targeted violence bill, rehabilitation bill, Dalits and minorities, and tribal rights, amongst others. You have worked in the Indian Administrative Service in the past. You've taught courses, you've lectured on poverty and governance in IIM Ahmedabad, in St. Stephen's, in JNU, in the University of Sussex, and many more. And this is just a very short, brief version of everything that you've done for us. But again, for those of us who don't know you, I think this is good enough. So I want to start by talking about my interaction with you and what I have sort of got from what you've done and from what I've seen you do. So from what I sense is that your life's work seems to lay a very heavy emphasis on ideas of equal belonging and especially on love. And from my short interaction with you during the Delhi riots, however distant it may have been, I could really tell that you practice what you preach. And I remember there was this one very moving moment for me. It wasn't a moment, but it was an observation, which was that I noticed that you don't try to distance yourself from pain and suffering. And in fact, I see you willingly expose yourself to it and embrace it. And this was especially evident during the riots and the NRC-CA protests, because I remember that you made an announcement of wanting to convert to Islam as a form of civil disobedience. And you did this not just to defy the unjust law, but you did this as a Gandhian form of civil disobedience, which is that you also accept the punishment that comes because of this transgression. So you've clearly, obviously, very rightly so, been the central figure of the anti-CA movement, and you have suffered. There is an FIR lodged against you for inciting the Delhi violence, the Delhi riots, which obviously is absurd, but it is the case. And but despite all these injustices that have been leveled at you, I see that you continue to give and that you continue to believe in this system, which has failed you and which has failed India. So I want to understand from you, having been a part of not just the CAA, but just seeing what it's like, what it's like for people to disproportionately suffer. What is the root of laws which create such exclusions, such disproportionate exclusionary sort of groups? Like what is their social, political, and economic backdrop?
So thank you so much. for having me and for starting this conversation. Uh, See, let me start by saying that I see in my work something that I try very hard to do with my colleagues and people around me is to reach there where there is the greatest pain, and I think that wherever where there is the greatest suffering, where there is the greatest injustice, uh, I feel I need to try to be there, uh, and and the work is to go not really even like a human rights worker or uh, a fact finder or somebody who's trying to uh, as somebody that you would go uh, in your family if somebody suffered, uh, or a close friend suffered, in that spirit. And I think that the idea of fraternity in our constitution is something that we understand very little. Uh, the Hindi word, in fact, in the constitution, in the Hindi constitution, is a very beautiful one, which means, which is bandhuta, कि हम एक दूसरे से बंधे हुए हैं. We are tied to and with each other, and therefore, if you suffer injustice, it is injustice that I experience as mine. Your pain uh, and tears should flow out of my eyes. That we must take care of each other. These are all ideas that I think we need to uh, learn and practice. Uh, uh, and it's not something that I try to do as work, but as a way of life and as a way of resistance. All of that together is what leads me to be there where there is the greatest pain. What causes this suffering, I think, is a question that you asked, if I understood correctly. I think that there are there are two kinds of suffering. There's some that is unavoidable by you, by us, uh, and then there's preventable suffering. And I think that what troubles me hugely about our world today is the extent of preventable suffering that we see around us. Preventable suffering uh, today, maybe 100 years ago it wasn't the case, but today no child should have to sleep hungry, and no child should be malnourished. No child should die because they don't have adequate health care. No child should have to sleep under the open sky. No old person should have to struggle till the last day of her life because there is no social protection. These are forms of preventable suffering. They're preventable by public action, which we have chosen not to do, not to take, not to do. India today has, and at this moment, something like 100 million tons, metric tons of grain. But that's because the new kharif crop is also coming. But we're looking at something like say, 70, 75 million metric tons. It doesn't mean anything to you or me, but an economist friend had told me that it means that if you put bags of grain in a line, then we have as much grain in government warehouses in India that we can go from the earth to the moon, and we can come back and we can circle the earth 2 or 3 times. When we have that much of grain and we have something like 200 million people sleeping hungry, or we have every third child malnourished, uh, which means that their bodies and brains are not being formed to full potential. Uh, when we when every third malnourished child in the world actually is Indian, uh, I feel that in some ways this is one of the most cruel periods in human history because we have the capacity many times over to prevent. this kind of suffering. Uh, and we can talk about hunger in a very detached kind of way, but I've spent many years working, with people who live with hunger. I was the Supreme Court Commissioner on the right to food for about 12 years. And in that capacity and in others, the suffering that, if you cannot feed your child, what pain that entails. And the fact that that is entirely preventable. Uh, so 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 that is preventable pain, and that is suffering that I find so utterly unacceptable. Even worse perhaps is, so that is suffering because we don't care, but there's suffering that we cause because we hate. So there's lynching, there's communal and targeted violence, there's violence targeting Dalits, targeting women with sexual violence, with domestic violence, with sexual minorities, uh, Adivasis. So, 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 so this is, and in today's climate in India today, Muslims are facing hate of multiple kinds. So that is again, you know, suffering uh, that is very hard to heal. Uh, so if there's an earthquake or a tsunami and I lose my home and I lose my loved ones, it's very hard to heal. But if I lose my home and my loved ones because my neighbors attacked me, then it is a suffering of a very, very different kind. Uh, and that is why it is so hard to heal.
From what I can tell of your response to this is that um, the suffering that is leveled at these disadvantaged groups, it's both systemic and it's something to do with our nature, our proclivity towards hate. So that's how. So my next question is related to that, which is that um, how much of so communal tensions between different cultures, between different communities, how much do you think can we attribute to some kind of um, you know to human nature, and how much do you think um, how much is it instigated by those in power, or as you have called it in one of your previous interviews, it's a kind of command hate crime?
See, I have seen communal violence now in many capacities. Um I, as a district administrator, I've handled, as a young officer, I was there during the 84 riots, during the riots leading up to the Babri Masjid movement. Um, I, dealt with riots after the Gujarat violence and massacre. I chose to leave the IAS, and I worked among the survivors, in fact, for many years. Uh, so, in that capacity, I've also studied, as a researcher, I've looked and understood riots a lot. Um, and, 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 uh, and I'm completely convinced that no, actually, the word riot is an inappropriate one, because riots seem to suggest that people of two communities, Hindus and Muslims, actually fight each other somewhat spontaneously. And that has not been my experience in most episodes of communal violence. There are a few exceptions, but very rarely. Uh, what we call riots is substantially in the nature of pogroms. Um, and riots don't happen spontaneously. So there are three things uh, that are necessary. for riots to happen. The first of them is what I call the manufacture of hatred. Hatred is not something that uh, uh, I feel there's spontaneous hatred, but it is systematically manufactured. So I mean, the most recent example of it is actually during the lockdown. It's extraordinary that people could begin to believe that people of one religious identity were somehow responsible for spreading uh, the the virus. And it's an idea that has spread so wide and far. It has led to boycott, to exclusion, to attacks, to violence. And the idea is so absurd, and yet it happened very systematically. So you had the government actually talking about one gathering, which was the Tablighi Jamaat. Uh, Incidentally, it happened at a time when many gatherings were happening, including, and one must remember, Parliament was in session at that time. So if people didn't realize the seriousness of those kinds of gatherings, um, there were many other religious gatherings. There was this meeting had happened with permission, and so on. So it was inappropriate. It did lead to infections, but so did many others. But the way that one such incident was not only focused upon, but in all official briefings, both by the central government and sadly even by the Delhi government, kept talking about the Markaz cases, the Tablighi cases, that it somehow entered people's consciousness that somehow this was the main cause of the spread of the virus, without holding government accountable for its many failings and so on. And then we simultaneously had uh, videos, fake videos, which depicted Muslims spitting on vegetables and so on, or coughing into people's faces, etc. And all of it was proved to be fake. Incidentally, no action has been taken against anybody that I know for circulating those hate videos. But collectively, it was what I call the manufacture of hatred. So hatred is manufactured, and it's a very, and the committed communal organizations that specialize, they know how through humor, through innuendo, and now also with the new forms of social media, how you create and manufacture hatred. Second, violence is organized. The logistics of the violence is organized. You don't suddenly have people with all the chemicals and gas cylinders and firearms, and it just suddenly, people just don't have it when a crowd of 500 or 1,000 people gather. How do people know which are houses belonging to a minority community, which are the shops they own, uh, which are specifically attacked? People have voters lists, etc. So they're people who actually systematically plan. But both of these are necessary conditions for the violence, but they're not sufficient conditions. Uh, Both of them can happen and still violence won't happen. The sufficient condition, necessary and sufficient condition for communal violence, is the role of the state. It is only when the state wishes for violence to happen and to continue does violence happen. Otherwise, even the biggest episode of communal violence can be controlled in a matter of hours, not days. So, so it is, and that is what makes these episodes of communal violence uh, so culpable. Uh, they occur because of organizations committed to manufacturing hatred and organizing violence, and to a state uh, which, which in a sense enables and sometimes even participates in the violence.
Yeah, and I would say that the organizations that I personally noticed contributing to hate speech, or at least were responsible for communalizing issues that didn't really have a communal angle were our mainstream media. We get our news from this media,
Yeah.
and now it seems as though we can't trust them.
Yes.
um, when the JNU incident happened, uh, we heard stories of the police just standing by while college students were being beaten up. It was a very bad night for me because this could be anyone. This could have been me. This could have been any child. And to know that you can't trust the people whose job it is to protect you and to create a safe space for you, it's harrowing.
So yeah, so the when the state plays this role, and uh, you empathize with it as a young person, as a young person in a university or just graduated, uh, but uh, working class people from uh, minority and Dalit backgrounds uh, have experienced this. You know, it was the anti-Sikh violence, the anti-Christian violence in Kandamar, but significantly, and of course, many episodes of attacks on Dalits. Um, and then, of course, you have a large majority of episodes of criminal violence targeting the Muslims. When you recognize and you understand that the state, which is meant, I mean, all the arms of the state, the police in particular, uh, and the leadership of the police and the political leadership, which are meant to protect you, and they don't deliberately, and then that they don't protect you, uh, and then later justice is not, legal justice is also uh, not enabled, again systematically, because of the role of various arms of the criminal justice system, including sadly not just the police prosecution but also the judiciary, that very few people are punished for their role in these uh, acts of criminal violence in the end. So, so we're living in that context. Uh, it is so important for us to stand in solidarity with those who suffer hate violence, and to communicate to them that they're not alone and that there are people who care. Right?
So I next wanted to ask a question, and this has something to do with a lecture of yours that I watched on YouTube. So this was a talk you gave on development, and you were talking about the development scholar Robert Chambers. And so I looked him up online, and interestingly, one of his quotes is he's quoted to say that his vision for the world includes putting the last first, which I found to be extremely beautiful. So you said in the talk that because science is rooted in the objective world and because it teaches us to be detached, it may be that the implicit message it's sending to us is a dehumanizing one. So I was thinking about this with respect to the IT cell departments, specifically the BJP IT cell department. So because I've been following the news ever since the NRCCA protests broke out, so I noticed that the department shows an attitude of deep bigotry and misandry. So my question to you is this: what do you think is the motivation for people writing such hate messages for WhatsApp? And do you think that they always relate to the party? Are they able to see beyond the propaganda? Does it have to do necessarily with the fact that they are STEM educated people? Or what could be, the reason for participating in such a wide scale spread of hate?
That's a great question and an important one, I think, for all of us to reflect upon. Uh, but we're talking about the IT cells, but actually we are speaking about our own family WhatsApp groups, and the WhatsApp groups with friends we've grown up in school and college, and friends in our workplaces. And you see the same hatred being actually uh, flaunted uh, in uh, in all of these spaces. Um, the IT cell is, of course, more easily explainable. There are people who are ideologically committed and they believe, uh, I mean, quite clearly, they believe in a country and a world which is built around um a continued sense of aggrieved resentment and hate by the majority community, which is made to feel somehow also the persecuted community, and so on. So they do this out of conviction. I mean, some people say that they're people who are paid, but I think a large part of it is out of conviction, probably. It's a dedicated cadre of people who believe in a certain ideology, which is the antithesis of what our constitution stands for. Uh, and and sadly, the people who stand in defense of the values of the constitution don't seem to have the same kind of organization, energy, commitment, and they also need a different discourse. But I don't think to respond to hate by hate will only deepen hate. So how do you have a discourse which is built around the ideas of love and solidarity and caring, which is what we try to do in the Karwan-e Mohabbat, is actually to develop a politics of radical love and a communication around ideas of radical love as a response to hate. Um, but coming to the larger question of our, you know, or our own, maybe even our own living room dining tables, let's start from there, and then that aunt and that uncle and that cousin and that school friend from who's my dearest friend from class one, and so on and so forth. What about them? What about this very courteous colleague I have at work who I couldn't imagine nurtured these kinds of ideas of hate? Um, I have a grandson who's 1 year old, now two, he's just turned two actually. Uh, and I often think about my childhood at his age and 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 looking at him now. I I don't think I'm unusual, but I do not recall through my childhood hearing a discourse of hate and bigotry around me. I didn't hear it in my home. We are a partition family. We were uprooted from Pakistan uh, and with a lot of violence. A lot of my family got killed, extended family. We left behind our homes, and yet we did not hear. I didn't hear this in school. I studied in an elite boys boarding school. I didn't hear it from my teachers, from my peers. I didn't hear it in my workplaces. I didn't hear it even when I joined the IAS. It was definitely a different time because my little grandson, from the time being able to understand the world, he's going to hear bigotry all around him. He's going to hear it, sadly, uh, in his own, in his extended family gathers, in living rooms. He will hear it i- at a very young age in his classrooms. He will hear it from his peers. He'll hear it from his teachers. What it means to be a Muslim child today in any gathering where you are one or two Muslim children and the kind of bigotry uh, that they both hear and other people articulate. It's something that children learn at a very early age. He will hear it. He will encounter bigotry on his social media. He will encounter it in the films he watches, the television serials he watches, and so on as he grows up. The world has changed hugely. And and I think about, I wonder, and it's not just India actually. It's quite interesting. When I travel to other parts of the world to teach or in other capacities, um, I hear that greater part of the world, more and more people are being attracted to leaders who legitimize hatred and bigotry. And in some countries, the United States, Brazil, and India, being three large democracies, we elect such leaders. In others, they may not get elected in France and in Germany, but they're forming increasing, and in much of Scandinavia, they're forming increasingly larger segments of the popular support, and they form formidable. Le Pen is openly racist, say in France. Her father was convicted for racism, and they have almost, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 30% of the vote share in France. So there's something that is happening around the world. The problem is not the leaders we select. I think that's sort of missing the point, because we are electing them. So the problem is not out there, it is here, right with us. Uh, I think we're living, in times when uh, there's a certain legitimization. You know, what is the popular discourse legitimizes hatred and bigotry, normalizes it, legitimizes it, and I would say what is worst of all, it valorizes it. So, so when you spout hatred, you're not a bigot. You're a hero. You're a soldier of the great Hindu nation. You have the 56-inch chest to be able to call a spade, to call out the enemy. Uh, and people like Gandhiji, who spoke about love, were actually effeminate, weak. This is the idea. And to be, and so there's a machismo, there's of uh, so hatred has become a symbol of masculine power. And I think that what they miss completely is the recognition that hatred is really the instrument of the coward. True courage is in being able to stand up when there's hatred all around you, and to speak in defense of love and solidarity, and to stand with the victim. And the finest example in our own country, in many generations, has to be Mahatma Gandhi's last days of his life. Because imagine that 1 million people have been killed in Hindu Muslim riots, and those were riots. Those were, partition did see large scale riots where people of the two communities attacked each other, and 1 million people died. Train loads of people were slaughtered on both sides, and there's 1 million people on both sides. Um, and with all of that, and people like my own extended family who were uprooted, were here in these refugee camps full of hatred. And it was very easy at that point for for India to say that Pakistan is based on a country for Muslims, so India will be a country for Hindus. But he said, and Jawaharlal Nehru said, uh, and of course, uh, Dr. Ambedkar, who led the writing of our constitution. Uh, Jawaharlal Nehru actually said, "Who does this country belong to?" And he said, any person who chooses to make this country her own, is an Indian. There's no other qualification. You don't have to, uh, and this is not a country of a particular religion or particular culture or caste. And Gandhiji, of course, he died, he gave up his life knowingly uh, for this idea of an India that belongs equally to people of every faith. So, uh, and then we have, of course, we have examples of radical love in the leadership of uh, Martin Luther King and Mandela and so on. And these are people who have stood up against hatred uh, with great courage. And so, so I don't know where we started this part of the conversation, but anyway, you can.
Yeah, I the question I was asking you was that given that we have people like Mahatma Gandhi, as you mentioned, and we have people who have been responsible for the making of an equal India, where the question was a little bit more specific to the STEM subjects, which is to say that where do we see this kind of um, detached thinking where it's easy to not care? Like, do you think it has anything to do with um, any particular discipline, and uh, like how do we specifically to do with like the BJP IT cell department? Um, why would anybody choose to do that? Um, and I don't think I'm convinced, as you said, that it's for money or it's because of any external
It is
motivation.
out of
There's
conviction.
definitely something inside us
Yeah.
that's making us do these things. I think Gandhi would agree, Tagore would agree, any of our great thinkers would agree.
You're right. I don't. There are no easy answers. There is something. I mean, am contradicting myself a little bit. There is something about leadership, of course, and I sometimes think about a leader like Mahatma Gandhi. I think that you see, it was not important what he stood for. It was that the majority of Indians, Hindu, Muslim, and so on, said that this will be a humane country, it will be an inclusive country, it will be an equal country of equal belonging. Uh, and the majority of Indians supported and stood behind him. And people like Maulana Azad, it was very difficult and very courageous of them to take that stand. And it's the same Indians today uh, who uh, are slipping into this open espousal of bigotry. Uh, so I think that, as I said, partly it is about leadership. Uh, I think that a leader like Mahatma Gandhi, I think each of us are comprised of both our best selves and our worst selves, and a lot in between. I think that what the true genius of Mahatma Gandhi's leadership was that he brought out the best in us. The true genius of the leaders we are electing today is that they're bringing out the worst in us. Uh, but it's all there. So that's one part. Uh, a question is often asked about, you know, how do we teach people love and solidarity? I, I, I wonder. You look at a small child from our privileged homes at a very young age. At a very young age, a child observes. So, up, there's a 4-year-old child, and you'll say, "Bete sab badon ke paँव छुओ." I wonder how he knows at that age that sab badon mein the domestic help is not included. You're not expected to touch her feet. That there are adults you can treat differently and somewhat disrespectfully, etc. How does a child learn it? He observes. He observes the normalized inequalities within even the intimate spaces of our homes. Yet I feel that at that age, I take that little boy or girl uh, in a car, and she sees a child her age in pouring rain at a traffic light banging. I'm sure she feels distress and pain. That is empathy. Uh, and I think what we teach the child to do is to not care, to not feel the distress, to see and look away. That's what we teach the child. So it is my conviction, and this is something that is debated a lot. I think it's been debated through centuries and generations. What is essential to human nature? And I think it is my conviction that empathy is something that comes naturally to us. It comes naturally to us to care, and we are taught to look away. Elie Wiesel was one of the survivors of the Holocaust, and he said the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. So, not all of us hate. Hate is still an active emotion. So the IT cell might hate, but the large majority of us don't care. And I think we are taught and raised not to care. Uh, and therefore, again, coming back to the present moment, uh, when the lockdown was announced by the Prime Minister, I was listening to him on television, and he said, all of you should now stay at home, work from home, keep social distance, wash your hands, and through this we will overcome the pandemic. While I was listening to him, I said, my God, uh, does he not remember that there are many people who don't have homes? Where will they go? Did he not remember that, in our cities, masses of people live, if you're 8, 10 people living in an 8 by 6 uh, kholi, uh, what kind, I mean, are you expecting that person to be locked up for weeks and months inside that space? There's no toilet. 150 people share a common toilet. Uh, no. So, in a sense, and you don't have running water, so how are you going to wash your hands? So, in a sense, the protections that the lockdown was offering were not even being offered to the poor. And I think it's very important to remember that. But the costs were devastating for the poor. There's costs for all of us, but for them. And so I'm just appalled that this kind of public policy decision was taken. And many of us don't realize even China at its peak put 5% of its population under lockdown. We put 100% with the smallest relief package in a country of this degree of inequality, where these protections. So, in a sense, we made it very clear whose lives matter and whose lives don't. Who has to be protected and who can be sacrificed. Whose lives are valuable and whose lives are dispensable. Made it very clear. At that point, when the Prime Minister asked us to bang thalis and light candles, when the middle class did that, did they not even think for a moment about the poor? How could they celebrate uh, a policy which, in its very core, uh, through the, it just abandoned the poor? And and for a middle class to have accepted that and to celebrate it, we're not evil people, but we don't care. And the step from that to hatred is not a very very long one. So I think that,
I'm really glad you brought out the middle class issue because I have been struggling to understand how, um, because I think in a business class, if you're part of the business class, at least they are directly being affected by the migrant crisis. Their industries have shut down. They understand, even if it's from a utilitarian perspective. I can't vouch for the fact that they actually care for their employees, but they actually see the impact of the crisis. But the middle class at large seems to be very indifferent, and you're right, it's that indifference that's very difficult to digest. And how are we going to, I feel so at loss of words. It's
yeah.
so
That's why I feel, I mean,
enchanting.
I've been talking about this. I wrote somewhere that this is, the pandemic has revealed us for who we are. And it's a moment, it should be a moment of, for civilizational introspection. What kind of civilization have we built? What kind of people have we become? And is this who we want to be? And can we think of a new social contract? Can we start building a social contract which is built on a recognition of the equal worth of different human beings? London, I mean, the UK is not a great example at all, and it's got a right wing government. But my friends who work with the homeless, I work with the homeless, so I was trying to find out what is happening in other parts. And my friends were telling me in London, uh, during the severe lockdown, uh, hotel rooms were empty, five-star hotels, other hotels, and all of them were booked, and all empty rooms and beds were booked for the homeless, paid by the state. I don't know when this will ever happen in India. How long will it take for us to even, so the government is very comfortable by saying, yes, yes, if you don't like the quarantine centers we've set up, you can go and stay in a hotel. And so the poor again had to live in, those quarantine centers were, people actually called it care. And if you didn't have coronavirus, there's a very high chance you'd pick it up in those conditions. Our comfort with this completely different standards and our absence of outrage. I've written in my book, I wrote a book called Looking Away: Inequality, Prejudice, and Indifference in New India, where I've argued a lot about this. And I've said that we in the middle class have exiled the poor from our conscience and our consciousness. But I say now that the pandemic and the lockdown has revealed how absolute is this exile. So when I look around, when I think justice is truly important. But at the very first place, can we just be kind? Just kindness. Can we reclaim kindness in our just feel, look around, you see a child, who's sleeping under the open sky, at least feel, I think she could have been my child. You know, to feel badly. I mean, even if you just felt a twinge in your heart, enough of us felt it, she wouldn't be sleeping there. We'd put pressure on our government to find solutions, and there are solutions, but we don't care. And I think, and you talked a little bit about disciplines as well. I think that was an interesting question. Uh, is there something about what we, how we study and what we teach? I think there has to be a problem. I was in the IAS. I was posted for 3 years on the faculty in Missouri for young recruits to the civil service. I loved my students, as I always do, and I used to spend much of my time. I saw my role as teaching them about these very values that I spoke about, and to fight communal prejudice or caste prejudice, gender prejudice among them, because they would be in positions of power, and those prejudices would have very, very adverse impact on the lives of very vulnerable people. Which is why I spent a lot of time and thought and care in how I interacted with my students. But I did notice that And that was a time when we particularly got very large numbers of youngsters from the IITs and the IIMs, particularly the IITs, and medical students as well. And the chances of people holding these highly communal and casteist and uh, misogynist sentiments was much higher in people who had emerged from these institutions. So there's clearly a huge problem there. Um, I, I, I do think that the classical philosophy, for instance, ethics, social sciences should be part of every curriculum. I do think it will make a difference.
Thank you so much for that answer, sir. You've touched upon a lot of topics, and one topic in particular I want you to elaborate on, which is government schemes that came out during the whole when the migrant crisis first emerged in the public conscience. So, one result was that our finance minister decided to send money through Jan Dhan accounts and completely forgetting the fact that there are people who don't even have them. So, this had eerie similarities to the period of demonetization when there were large lines in front of banks and most of them were poor people you know
Yeah.
so my question to you is this: is there any way that technology can be used to humanely help the people who are most disadvantaged, or are we always doomed to, find only further divisions through this medium?
See, a lot, uh, some of my colleagues are suspicious of technology. In its very nature, uh, it will be anti poor. I don't agree with that. I think that technology is what we, uh, what we, how we use it and what we make of it. And one of my favorite examples of something that has really helped the poor hugely is actually the mobile phone. And think of a migrant, and we've seen how millions of migrants have to live very lonely lives far away. Uh, it was not long ago when, if you were a migrant and you left your village, it was very hard to keep in touch. Your family wouldn't know whether you were alive or dead, except for the occasional letter you would write, which would reach 15 days later. Then, when what were called STD phones started, PCOs, they were very expensive, and you then had to you had to ring up somebody who had a phone, and then you'd say, "I'm calling in 1 hour, 2 hours," and then the person would be called from their home, and then you'd get those 3 minutes, and you'd have to spend some 15, 20 rupees for a short call. And so from there to now, I mean, when I speak to migrants, and I speak a lot to migrant workers, the mobile phone has actually, uh, they spend at least 3 or 4 times a day. A lonely single migrant worker 1,000 kilometers away from home is able to speak to his family. If he's a little slightly better off, he will invest on a smartphone where he can see his child smiling and growing. So technology enabled that, and it would be, to my mind, uh, foolish uh, uh, to not recognize that technology can be used both for, and I can give you, I mean, the same social media has been used to propagate hate to a degree that is unthinkable. The digital divide, you see it again now with children who are not able to study. The assumption that government has that everybody will have a smartphone, and you might even, I mean, even a lower middle class family might have one smartphone, but there may be three children, and the father and mother who have to take the smartphone to work, and how are they going to do their studies, etc. Uh, so I don't think the problem is in technology in itself. It is in the use of technology. So Aadhaar was used uh, has been used in ways that, of course, there are dangers of surveillance and invasions of one's privacy, but Aadhaar has also led to exclusions of a massive kind for many reasons in ration shops and in other places. So I don't. I mean, I think that it's completely. If there is a resolve uh, uh, to have outcomes of equity, technology uh, can be used to assist in that. If your resolve is to, I work with, one of the many things I'm involved in is work with homeless people, and we do have a street medicine program where our colleagues go out on the streets. Now, uh, the use of IT in medicine is, in private hospitals, and it costs a lot of money, etc. But we are really struggling to, I really realize that if my street medicine team of this young male nurse and other people, if they could actually have a good computerized system where uh, homeless people move around, so you could have a way of mapping where the person is on a Google map. uh, the doctor, you should be able to converse with the doctor. You should have a way of getting, so technology could work for the most destitute homeless person. It can work for Mr. Amitabh Bachchan in his COVID ward as well, so a COVID room as well. So I think technology is not the problem, but I mean, just on the side, you spoke about the policies. I mean, I'm just appalled by the policies because, see, uh, even, belatedly, when the finance minister announced now 500 rupees a month for those who have accounts and could access them. I was just thinking that it amounts to about a day or a day and a half of statutory minimum wages. Now, suppose the middle class was told that, for the sake of the country, etc., you'll stop getting any wages or salaries. But to some of you whom we can reach through some kind of mechanism, we will give you 1.5 days of salary, and even 6 kilos of grain, not to forget. What would you have felt? And okay, then, and plus you don't have any savings. So just to play the mind game further, you're a middle class person, and all your savings for some reason are like demonetization, are frozen, and you have no health insurance. That also is, and you have 1.5 days of transfer of some cash, and 6 kilos of grain. Uh, how would we have coped? And how are we so comfortable with millions of the poor being actually given this? And why uh, why is there no outrage even now? I don't find the newspapers, I don't find op-eds, I don't find people saying this is, we just can't treat our people this way.
So I actually attended a webinar by P. Sainath, who is the founder of Pari.
Yes.
So one thing he said, which was so obvious and yet something I didn't even think about, was that, the migrant workers, they've always existed, but
Yeah.
this is the first time in history that they have space in the mainstream media.
Yeah.
And I mean, forget the fact that it's a very small space and the issue isn't even being represented to the extent, to its true extent. But the
And
fact that
I
people
mean,
are acting as if it's the first time,
yeah.
they're hearing about migrant workers, that itself shows how, I mean, completely detached we are from who really runs our, not just the economy, but the backbone of our
Right.
everyday lives.
For everyday life, that's exactly what Sainath was saying is completely correct. I mean, just think about it. I mean, give me about a minute or two, and let me just start ranting. They build our homes, they plumb our homes, they maintain our homes when there's repairs required. They provide the electricity. They clean our homes. They take care of our children so that we can work. They take care of our older people. They clean our streets. They drive us to work. They drive us to places. I can just go on and on. They're there at every turn of our lives, and we never saw them except as as people who exist. They cooked our food. They served our food, uh, and so on. And and exactly this, and we didn't even notice them. I mean, they just, and even now you talked about industrialists and builders and all of that. They still interested them as a factor of production. And they recognize them at least as a factor of production. But that a worker is also a human being, just like you and me. Uh, and it's even worse now in the pandemic. So a worker who is infected is a body with a contagion, not a human being you know, who is living this really difficult life without a public health system which works, maybe far away from his family, frightened. We're only looking at that person as this body with a contagion. And before this, we looked at the person as a body uh, whose life's purpose is to make our lives comfortable. So are we done? No.
No, no, no. Unfortunately for you, we are here to pick at your mind a little bit more. So I had one question to ask regarding the migrant crisis, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while. So do you think there is any way that this migrant crisis could benefit the migrant workers? Because UP has, as you I'm sure know, that Yogi Adityanath, he's decided to change the labor laws and he's amending them on really brutal lines.
Mhm.
And so there are reports that the laborers have refused to come back to these cities. So do you think that this resistance could benefit their futures in any way? And do you think that this could change the way our industries operate? Or do you think there could be a time where they would be seen with greater humanity?
I wish that was the case, but almost immediately, the state's responses, not just the UP government, but governments across the country, chose to use this moment to take away even the small protections that the law still gave them. I mean, one lesson could be, okay, let me just explain how appalling the situation of labor protection is. Um, I was writing and trying to plan, and we were writing an article together with Prabhat Patnaik and Zoiti Ghosh, two very fine economists who I have great regard for. Was trying to say this needs to be done, and I'd gone to the Supreme Court as well. And we thought through this article we'll try to say, and we said that you had to, if you and I in the middle class were assured our salaries through, uh, you must ensure the equivalent of minimum wages to every per family, which worked out to about 7,000 rupees per household. And we calculated that it cost 2 to 3% of the GDP. It was something, and the economy would have been in a very different shape if we had actually done it. Uh, but when we started thinking about the logistics of it, now in rural India, because of NREGA, you have job cards, you have a registration of workers, and you have bank accounts. So it is feasible if government decided that we will transfer 7,000 rupees to every NREGA job card holder. It was something that was feasible. In urban areas, actually there's no list at all. No government has the faintest idea, not only about how many, but about who uh, their workers are, which means that there wasn't even the laws require registration, uh, but the law is very peculiar because it requires the employer to register, and then it disincentivizes the employer, because why should the employer register you? Because then there are further liabilities on you. And if the labor department is corrupt enough to let you go. And in the informal sector, only 17% of workers have somebody who can be recognized and earmarked as an employer. The others are either casual daily wage workers or self-employed people, etc. So we have a system where there was not even not even uh, remote, and literally Patnaik in the end said the only thing we can recommend is like during an election, we'd say this week any adult person can come and take the cash, and we'll put some ink, indelible ink on your first finger, and the next week we'll put it on your second finger. I mean, we were driven to that that degree of desperation. Of course, nobody listened to us, and no cash transfers of this kind were made. But even if they did, uh, and so learning from that, the first thing would have been is that we must start a system of self-registration and self-attestation of all workers to start with, so that. But far from it, we're trying to make labor, the little bit of labor protection that exists, also get diluted. So there's no chance of that happening as far as we can see. On the other hand, I've been talking and reading, and I feel a real sadness. I mean, we helped. I mean, in Karwan Mohabbat, we tried to provide food and solidarity, etc., and send back buses, etc. Uh, and some of the conversations, and people were so anguished when they were going back कि हम किसी हालत में वापस नहीं आएंगे. Uh, and for some, you see, what we have to recognize was that it was not just the economic suffering, but the sense of a betrayal of trust. They never expected the state to protect them or their employers to protect them, but they didn't expect to be completely abandoned and thrown to the wolves in the way that they were. And I think that will leave a very, very deep wound on the psyche uh, of our workers. And yet already they're saying there's no work in the village, and so people are and will come back, and then there'll be even less bargaining power, because in this desperation they still, you know they still had to come back. So I think that when I spoke earlier about new social contract, I can't see, until we recognize the equal worth of every human being, uh, and we restore a sense of empathy uh, in our social relations. If we agree that we have the resources now in this country to ensure that there's at least a floor of human dignity below which no one will be allowed to fall, no one will, no child will die of hunger, or no child will sleep hungry, no child will sleep under the open sky, etc. Uh, unless we reimagine our world around notions of solidarity, things are not going to get better. We can change laws, we can conceptualize policies, but as somebody who's worked a huge amount on public policy for the poor all my life, in many capacities, I've reached a stage now when I've realized that a just and caring state, in the end, can only exist in a just and caring society. And once again, I say the problem is not out there, it is with us. And we'll have to think of us as a people, as a civilization, as, what, how do we want to raise our children? In what kind of world do we want to raise them? Uh, I think we'll have to have those most fundamental conversations. Otherwise, you will make one more set of laws which will never get implemented.
So interesting you're saying that, because I have been reading Gandhi a lot, and Gandhi always talks about spiritual reformation.
Mhm.
That independence is sought inside us. Like, it's not something that the British will give us; it's something we give
We have to give
ourselves.
ourselves, yes, yes.
So this will be our last section before we end this talk, and this is a section of audience questions. So one of the questions that has been asked is, so you, and this has something to do with what you said in your Jamia Wala speech, where you said that the only response to an unjust law such as the CAA and NRC is a Gandhian style civil disobedience. And I would say that what happened in the next 3 months was very much that. And I don't think that the government expected, uh, you know, Indian citizens to come out in such large numbers. I think they expected, they thought they had more power over us than,
But
than
but the
was the
pushback that they're
case.
doing now is a result of that, and they're completely rattled by, because what the Indian people came out and showed was the complete antithesis of the ideology of the RSS and Hindu supremacist nationalism that they stand for, uh, and the fact that the constitution became the rallying call, uh, and non-violence, and the national flag and the national anthem became an anthem of revolt. It was a wonderful moment, but it almost now sounds like it was like distant history. Mhm. Mhm.
I can't tell you how much my heart broke when I saw Shaheen Bagh being torn down the way it did,
Mhm.
because I gave so much of myself to that site. It
Mhm.
was almost like a homecoming for me. It was unlike any protest site I've ever seen. And because I'm young, I haven't seen protests before
Yeah.
this moment in history. You may have. So for
But
me, it
but
was
but
like,
but still, there's I was a student at the time of the anti-emergency, which is the closest that we can see. This was much more extensive, and the values that I think th- this is these 3 months was the closest that India will see of the spirit of the freedom struggle. Uh,
that's true. That's true. So, I mean, going back to that, do you think that given the pushback that we gave the government and the pushback that the pandemic has, not the pushback, but the way our funds are now being, they're now being pushed into at least attempting to help those who are being disadvantaged. Do you think there is a future where the BJP would still push the NRC CAA? Do you think it's even viable? Do you think they'll be able to generate jobs, anything for those they plan to rehabilitate?
See, uh, I had, those three, it was a long, dark night, and suddenly we had this flash of brilliant light, and but I had never imagined that we would come so quickly into a place of even greater darkness, as we do now. Uh, what the government has done through its charge sheets and is to alter the narrative completely. And so what they're saying is that the anti-CAA protests were a conspiracy against the nation. And people like me, the speech I gave in Jamia was entirely, and it was a very spontaneous moment. It was the day after the students were beaten in the library, and there was huge anguish. And uh, I was with the students through the night before, at the police stations, with many others, and we got the students out. And then they called me that I must speak to them, and I really spoke, saying that this is not a fight about a particular law. It's about the kind of country we need to give to our children, and that you cannot fight darkness with darkness. It will only make it more dark. We have to find ways of fighting hate with love. And I said, also importantly to the Indian Muslims, that you uh, that never let anybody uh, ask you to prove your uh, loyalty to this nation and love for this nation, least of all those who never took part in the freedom struggle, and that the rest of us actually are Indian by chance because we had no other country to choose. But your ancestors had a choice, and they chose between a country founded on the idea of religion, and to a country which is founded on the idea of equal respect for all religions. And your parents chose this, and therefore you're Indian by choice, and we are Indian by chance, and so on. And so these were the things I said. And then, of course, I also said that when there's injustice, it's a duty, as Gandhiji taught us, uh, to to disobey, but with non-violence and with peace. And lastly, of course, which has been quoted and misquoted and so on, I said that this is not something that is going to be resolved. This question about what kind of country we will have, it will not be resolved in Parliament. Our political parties don't seem to be having the moral courage and mettle to fight this battle there. It's not going to be resolved in the courts, and I'm disappointed by many of the decisions of the court. But also, and I've said this elsewhere, it's also not a question. I mean, suppose the courts also said that no, the in the law, this is not. Uh, there's a legal word, reasonable classification, etc. That's not the point. The point is precisely about whose country and who belongs and on what terms. And so I said it will be resolved by we, the people of India, on the streets fighting peacefully. But even more than that, it will be resolved in another place, and that is your hearts and mine. And whether we've allowed hate to colonize our hearts, or uh, whether we have, filled our hearts with love and solidarity. I mean, that's being called a hate speech, and
And somehow Kapil Mishra's speech has been completely erased out of memory.
uh,
Modi ji ka statement that the perpetrators will be recognized by their clothes.
yeah,
Yogi's call for vengeance. ये तो हुआ ही नहीं.
जी बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. Hmm. So,
This is very sad.
hmm.
So yeah, so the a follow-up question is, why do you think universities are being targeted, especially Muslim majority universities, or universities like JNU, which quote unquote express anti-nationalist sentiments?
See, for many reasons. I mean, if you look at Nazi Germany, you found exactly the same, that liberal uh, universities of liberal education were attacked, and all authoritarian leaders are frightened of universities. Uh, a place like JNU represents uh, a place where young people from highly disadvantaged backgrounds uh, are able to get together, and they get an education and an articulation and understanding of the world, which is their own, and they dream and articulate the idea of a more just society. They speak about secular values. They speak about everything which is the antithesis of what the ideology of the ruling government is. And so they are very clear that their opposition is not inside parliament. That is highly saleable and tradable, and they figured out that their opposition is outside parliament, and a significant part of that opposition is in the university. And through human history, it is young people who have over and over again led led people to to fight uh, for for countries and for communities and for worlds which are more just and uh, equal. And they pose a threat, they with the independence of their thinking, uh, and so they've crushed them. And of course, Muslim student universities with both Muslim identity and left liberal sort of uh, ethos. Those are the ones that they particularly targeted. I think that they completely miscalculated. They felt that after the anti-CAA protests, if they attack, AMU and Jamia brutally, uh, like in everything else, we just won't care. uh, and all protests would be crushed. But the way students from across the country and even in institutes of management, I was invited by the students at IIM Bangalore, for instance, and it was really heartening the kind of protests that they had mounted in places where we didn't associate with this kind of protest and thinking. So I think that universities are attacked because rightly the government recognizes them to be bastions of opposition to everything that the RSS ideology stands for.
And do you think that the fact that there are, how do I frame this? So I want to basically ask if there is any kind of, if there is anything lacking in the Muslim leadership of this country, that somehow they are so unprotected by, or they don't find any sort of leader to look up to or seek help from, or sort of band together with.
Um, I think there's a problem with leadership in general, not just of the Muslim community. Who do we look up to at this point of time in any community? And on the other hand, uh, both in the young Muslim women and men, and during the protests, and uh, in the Dalit and Adivasi communities, in sexual minorities, in women, we are seeing the rise of, again, it is very threatening to the ruling establishment. Uh, but I am, and the who are the first who the government is incarcerating? They're giving a very clear lesson that if you are young and you dissent, you're treading dangerous ground. You're young and Muslim, and you criticize the government, uh, even more dangerous. You're young Muslim and a woman, and you actually raise slogans against the government, and give speeches, and we'll show you. And don't you dare and we think that you can do this again. The message is very clear, and I think that uh, it might crush dissent for a bit, but in the end, it is young people who will have to throw up another kind of leadership from the communities. But I'm also very convinced that if solidarity has any meaning, it is not as if Muslims have to solve problems of Muslims, and Dalits have to solve problems of Dalits alone, or persons with disability have to solve problems, or women have to fight. You have to have the persecuted community at the center of the battle, but you have to have solidarity as well. Uh, and I think that that a leadership, uh, that we struggle with that kind of leadership across. I mean, in the political spectrum, who can you think about who can inspire you in the way, say, Bernie Sanders can inspire you, or the New Zealand Prime Minister, who's quite my favorite, Ardern, less than 40 years old, and the kind of leadership she has shown. Uh, uh, so I think that there is a crisis of leadership, but not just in the Muslim community.
So we have two last questions for you. The first is from somebody who I would suppose comes from a STEM background, because they ask, how can we pursue objectivity while also teach people to care? Because don't emotions cloud our objectivity? How would we arrive at uh, the correct sort of worldview without sort of detaching ourselves from the situation. Like, how do we get science and the humanities together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a great dilemma as well. I think that the social sciences have too long tried to mimic the physical sciences, uh, and to feel, there's something that, like, there's this cold external reality that you have to approach and study in this very detached, uh, and inverted commas scientific um, method. I think studying the world of studying the human condition in the broadest sense, uh, it's not a cold external reality. It's a lived reality. It's a reality that we are part of, even as we study it. And when you're looking at people of disadvantage, then there's also the question of the vulnerability, the questions of solidarity, the questions of ethics. So it's my very strong conviction that this idea of detached, only through being detached and not taking sides, uh, can you do scientific research and understanding, is a spurious and false idea. It's also very masculinist. And I think that feminist epistemology has taught us a lot. And it's taught us about uh, engaged scholarship and responsible scholarship, and a scholarship that is founded actually uh, in an ethic of caring and responsibility. Uh, and it's the only kind of scholarship that I am willing to practice. Uh, and it is only through that mode of scholarship can I that I've been able to understand, as a person who's male and brought up in privilege, at least in substantially relative privilege. Uh, for me to begin to understand and to stand in solidarity with people who have suffered various kinds of injustice, it is only uh, I sometimes tell my students about that I want to teach them how to think through their hearts, to care, and then think. So, somewhat, let me say, Amartya Sen, in his book called The Idea of Justice, he towards the end he asks a very very interesting question. He says that uh, there's no community of human beings anywhere in the world through human history who have no, which is not characterized by injustice of some kind. But he says that also there is no society of human beings anywhere in the world in history which has not been characterized by resistance to injustice. And he asks why. And he says there are three things in human nature, he believes, that uh, makes it makes resistance to injustice universal to the human experience. And the first of them is the quality of empathy, our capacity to feel and care about the pain of the other. The second, he says, is the capacity of reasoning. You care and then you question why. And the third, he says, the universal love of freedom. And it is because of these qualities of empathy, reason, and the love of freedom that we, uh, we, we resist injustice. But I think it is precisely these three qualities coming together that for me defines true scholarship.
I think that was really beautifully put.
Mhm.
Uh, okay, so one last question before I let you go. And this has something to do with the fact that you call yourself a Gandhian. So how do you feel
I
when?
don't really. I mean, and let me correct you immediately. I don't think there are many. I don't think I lead as austere a life as would qualify me to be a Gandhian. And I have disagreements with some parts of what Gandhiji stood for, particularly his attitude to caste. I hugely admire Mahatma Gandhi, and I am continuously in these times that we live in grateful that at the moment, at the time when the idea of India was being imagined, he was the father of our nation. At least he imagined a country which would be kind and equal. And I'm eternally grateful to him for this. But I'm influenced also by Dr. Ambedkar, by Martin Luther King, by a whole range of feminist scholars, uh, and definitely by Karl Marx. And so there are many influences. So if who am I? So even somebody asked me, then I sort of cough and feel a little sort of embarrassed. And if I have to define myself, I wouldn't call myself a Gandhian or a Marxist or an Ambedkarite. If I had to, I would say I'm a humanist, feminist, of some kind, socialist maybe. But even these are abroad. So anyway, sorry, that was a long interruption. Mm.
No, no, no. That was actually really good because it's very important to, um, at least that's what I think, to sort of know where you stand with regards to your heroes. Because I think there is a lot of hero worshipping that happens.
Yeah.
There is not enough critical thinking that happens. So I think it's great that despite Gandhiji being a father of our nation, we can still look at him and say, here is where we don't think you were right, sir.
Mhm.
I think that's great. So, but the question I was going to ask was, ki, we see the BJP invoke Gandhi as being the inspiration behind the NRCC. They constantly criticize Nehru, the INC. So I wanted to I wanted to understand from you, what do you think is the major difference between Gandhi's, Nehru's, the INC's vision for India, their idea of nationalism, and what the kind of nationalism that BJP is promoting?
See, firstly, of course, there was a complete lie in when they said that Gandhi's dream was that India would be a country uh, which would be a haven for Hindu minorities in neighboring countries. And Rajmohan Gandhi, who's his biographer and grandson, actually wrote a very beautiful and important rejoinder. He said, in fact, Gandhi's dream was the very opposite. He said, I want to see a 50-mile line of of Hindus and Sikhs in India returning to Pakistan, and an equally long line of Muslims who've gone from India returning to India. That was Gandhiji's dream. So let's be very clear that he had a very very different conception. Uh, uh, you talked about uh, Nehruji and I think Maulana Azad is important. But let me, because we're running out of time, let me talk about one story that is told about Mahatma Gandhi uh, a few actually months before he died. Uh, Anis Kidwai, in her memoirs, she's written this. Her husband was a congressman who died during the riots trying to save people's lives. She was a widow. She didn't even go through her iddat. She came to Gandhiji saying, this is a time of so much suffering with partition and so on. Wanted to reach you. And she found Gandhiji in Delhi very, very sad. And he said something to her. He said, uh, मेरा काम तब तक पूरा नहीं होगा जब तक एक मुस्लिम बच्चा बिना डर के इस शहर में खेल ना सके. And it's just a very very simple, it's very it keeps coming to me. And look at what India we built. And just around that time, he'd also written this talisman where he said, when you're in doubt, think of the most vulnerable person, the weakest, and whether this would have make sense to them. And you couldn't have had the lockdown if you had thought about the weakest. it just wouldn't have made sense to you. So I think, I mean, to me, they're actually these two talismans together, which suggest to me the kind of country that Gandhiji, uh, that Nehru, that Tagore, that Maulana Azad thought about, which is a country of equal belonging to all, where there were no obligations to conform to particular religious or cultural, to be yourself and still feel you can belong equally. I've spent a lot of my early childhood in Arunachal Pradesh, where I've seen tribal communities where there's a community where in the whole world there's just 300 people who speak a language. And to me, that's really beautiful because they are equally Indian, like in every respect. So it's a country of equal belonging, a humane and inclusive country. I think we're being taught by our leaders today that you can only prove you you love if you hate. So I can love my country only if I hate another country. We know which country. You love your religion if you hate the other religion, etc. And and we're saying, but why? And that young woman who spent so many months in jail through the lockdown, uh, Amulya, in 19 years old, she said, Pakistan Zindabad. And if you listen carefully to her, this is precisely what she was saying. Why should I hate Pakistan? I wish well to Pakistan. And, all credit to her. So that is my mom. So let me end by saying, Pakistan Zindabad is where let me end this discussion.
सर आप एक और FIR लग जाएगा, you should be careful.
Good.
But thank you so much for this conversation. I don't know about the viewers, but for me this was really helpful, because I've struggled so much in these past few months. Because for me and for the rest of the nation, I'm sure the light that the anti-NRCCA the protests they brought to my life, to see them, to, as you said, to see darker times emerge out of it, it was absolutely heartbreaking. So thank you so much for this conversation. This was almost therapeutic. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you.
And I sincerely hope that the FIR that has been unfairly lodged on you is, I don't think they will take it away, but कुछ होए उसके बारे में,
It's a
क्योंकि
charge
बहुत
sheet.
गलत हुआ है.
It's not even an FIR, it's a charge sheet. It's
अच्छा,
several charge sheets, actually. Yeah. Anyway,
it's just insane. And you have my full solidarity, and I'm sure you have the full solidarity of the entire Indian nation, because you have fought for us, you have fought for the most disadvantaged, and they know that. So thank you so much.
thank you so much. Love, pleasure to talk to you, Shweta.